The film takes place in San Quentin, the oldest prison in the state of California, where young Ron has just been admitted for drug possession. Ron comes from a good family, so an excellent lawyer takes on his case, but even that did not help him get accepted into a rehabilitation center. After all, the state wants to use him as an example for young people. However, our protagonist is not prepared for his new life in a prison filled with dangerous inmates and gangs of various ethnicities. If there is one thing everyone agrees on, it is that they hate spoiled kids. Just like the new kid, Ron soon meets Earl Copen, the most influential prisoner in the facility, so much so that the guards occasionally do him favors, even allowing him to visit their office as proof of his power. We see that his gang beat up an inmate who was selling drugs without his permission. Interested in learning more about Earl, Ron turns to his cellmate Gene, a transvestite who had once been Earl's cellmate, whom he describes as a very serious person, but if you show loyalty can be very friendly. However, Earl is testing the patience of the head guard, Seaman, who warns him that he will never be released if he continues with his internal crimes, especially the drug sales. Meanwhile, Ron gets into trouble with Mike, a dangerous inmate who brands him a snitch for a rival gang, forcing him to arrange a meeting with Mike in which he might possibly end up dead. Aware of his own nervousness, Ron chooses to ignore it. Soon, Ron asks Mike for a knife, even though Earl explains that they only intend to lure him to a lightly guarded pavilion to abuse him, and offers to handle the matter himself. Thus, Mike is met and told that the rumors about Ron are completely false, so they will soon deal with the culpable inmate, while Earl's men enjoy their own distilled alcohol with Ron. However, they are quickly discovered by the guards. Even though they end up in punishment cells, Ron tried to warn Earl about the guards, earning Earl's respect. Using his legal knowledge, Earl advises Ron to review his report and plead not guilty at the next trial before the prison board. When the time comes, Ron follows this advice and is immediately released from the isolation pavilion, even though the lawyer Hostback recommends that he stay away from air. When Ron thanks him, Hostback reveals that he manipulated his report in Ron's favor. Generally, when a gang helps a newly arrived prisoner too much, it means they want to treat him as a plaything, but that is not the case with Ron. Thank God he becomes Earth's protege, and thanks to that, Ron is able to quit his tedious job in the furniture workshop. Despite his gratitude, the young man shows interest in how his new friend can do so many things. Accordingly, his friend reveals that he has spent 18 years in prison, plenty of time to learn how to use the institution to his advantage. Shortly after, Ron receives permission to be transferred to the air pavilion, but first he gets a warning from Simon, who tells him not to get him into trouble, or he will lose his chance at parole. Later, all the African-American prisoners unite in a strike to demand better services. During that time, another inmate tries to enter the workshop to have them sign his worksheet, but the African-Americans do not hesitate to beat him up for sabotaging their strike. This sparks a brawl between that group and the rest of the inmates. However, the situation does not escalate further thanks to the appearance of the guards. At one point, an inmate seeks revenge for the death of the one who tried to work, but he is calmed down, while at the same time, some gang-affiliated inmates take advantage of the tense atmosphere to stab their debtors, prompting the guards to issue a warning and force them to line up against the wall. Afterward, everyone is forced to return to their cells for a long time. Thanks to his influence, Earl has the option to leave if he wishes, but he decides to stay for the sake of his reputation among the inmates. Shortly thereafter, the prisoner invites Ron to share uncommon delicacies available in prison. Yet if you really want to know why he hasn't yet moved to his pavilion, the young man confesses that lately he's been very paranoid and does not feel comfortable at all in prison. Earl understands his point of view and makes it clear that he has no intimate intentions with Ron. He only sees him as an apprentice with a lot of potential. Finally, Ron accepts the offer, moving into a very comfortable cell with a good bed and even a library, and he begins his new job as a barber, shaving countless inmates. All these gifts and privileges are recommendations from Air to help him get out of prison. And he'd better hurry, for Congress has approved a new law stipulating that a judge can modify any sentence within 120 days. But once that time expires, nothing can be done for the next 5 years. In his new role as assistant to Professor Harrell, Ron catches the attention of Bach, a large inmate. Over time, the protagonist continues his efforts to be seen as no threat to society, receiving constant help from Earth, who managed to manipulate his psychological report. If everything continues as well as it is now, Ron will soon be released on parole. For this, he expresses his gratitude, and as soon as he returns to the outside world, he promises to send all kinds of gifts to pay off his debt. Before starting another day at work, Ron decides to stop by the bathroom, where he is ambushed by Buck, who thinks he is some sort of prostitute because of his frequent meetings with Earl. Consequently, Buck does not hesitate to subdue him and even inserts his finger in his rear. However, things do not progress further due to the arrival of Harold. Ron is so traumatized by the event that he forgets his promises of good behavior. He then obtains an improvised knife from a vendor. As soon as Earl learns of this, he confronts Ron immediately, reminding him that a beating from Buck would suffice to quench his thirst for revenge, though it is something they should do together. Nonetheless, Ron cannot contain his eagerness and intercepts Buck in the gym. Buck soon appears to help him, but when Ron finds himself overwhelmed by Buck, he has no choice but to stab the giant in the back. Because of the gravity of that crime, and since Simon can intervene on their behalf, both end up in the worst possible pavilion with no benefits whatsoever. Even though Ron's blood was found at the crime scene and Buck spoke against him, Ron declares his innocence at the board trial. Shortly after, Simon visits him to deliver the news that Buck was murdered in the infirmary with cockroach poison, and of course, the board points to Ron as the mastermind behind the crime, ruining his chance at parole. Ron tries to appeal his case in a formal trial, but his recent history works against him, and he won't be able to request a new trial for another 5 years. Left with only the scant materials in his cell, Ron manages to cut a vein and pretend he is insane so that he is not transferred to an even worse prison. Back at the trial, Ron reunites with his father, James, who promises that he will sell his house to pay for his freedom, even though his son is now a troubled man. Upon returning to San Quentin, the young man meets with Earl, who has a plan to escape from prison but needs outside help. And who better than the desperate James, willing to do anything to free his son? While discussing the plan in the showers, Hermandad, an African-American inmate who was singing in response, attacks both of them with a razor, though the incident doesn't escalate beyond that. The injured are sent to the infirmary, and the rest of the prison uses this as an excuse to attack every African-American they see, a move that would jeopardize their escape plans. However, the situation is handled diplomatically by the African-American leader, who reveals that the attacker was not only a lunatic, but had no intention of starting a gang war. Nevertheless, the next day, Knowles is found dead in a garbage container, and as usual, the board points to Ron as the culprit, even though he proclaims his innocence. Soon after, those suspicions dissipate when an African-American inmate nicknamed Iron Man becomes the new suspect. Perhaps he killed Knowles for personal reasons or to frame Earn. Who knows? During a baseball game, Air notices the garbage truck where the crushed body of Knowles was found. In other words, the guards never inspect it because they assume that any inmate hiding in a garbage container will end up that way. It is a very risky plan for escape, but with some sort of tool, they might be able to avoid death. Therefore, Earl begins making preparations with his gang to help the next day in line for the dining hall. He and Ron manage to sneak into the kitchen, where they obtain the metal bars needed for their plan. Immediately afterward, they disguise themselves as janitors to reach the garbage area. The first to jump into the garbage truck is halted by the sudden appearance of a guard who shuts the doors to the outside. Left alone, Ron uses one of the metal bars to slow down the truck's crushing machine, and fortunately, manages to hold on long enough, thus achieving his longed-for freedom. As he watches the truck from the prison yard, he does not appear sad because for him, it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.